What's up, ceramic students? Welcome back to the studio. We should have a couple pieces now that are pretty dry in the studio. I like to keep mine under my bin here, not necessarily because I'm trying to keep them humid, but because it stops me from accidentally knocking them around here in the studio or setting something down on top of them. These bins are really great. They're multi-purpose. They'll be our sort of damp boxes, a place to keep the pieces humid, but also just a way to protect your work while you're traveling with it, or while it's even just kind of sitting in your studio. Now you can see over my shoulder I actually got a variety of different sizes of these sort of things set up in the studio. This is just a larger bin that allows me to work in multiple pieces or larger works, and I just have a larger canvas board underneath it. So if you've got something like that sitting around your home studio, or you'd like to make one, I can definitely help you with some of the materials at school that you would need to build it out. I'll be sticking with sort of the smaller pieces here. That way I know that I'm building at about the level that you guys can have. Now, if you need to start transporting these things back and forth to school, I'm going to recommend using those bins, possibly packing it with maybe your hand towel, or even occasionally using little bits and pieces of foam. These pieces are really fragile now, so when they come to school to be fired, you've really got to be careful with them. The pinch pots that we've done so far, they're pretty small, probably not too many pieces that are hanging off, so they're pretty structurally sound. But if you added anything really delicate to the outside, you want to be really careful that you don't knock those off. There's no way to get them reattached after the clay has been dried like this. The best we can do would be to fire the whole thing and then glue it on when we're all done. But today in this tutorial, we're actually going to begin our next hand building process. Right now, we're sort of looking at pieces that are roughly about the size of your hands, right? 1, 2, 3 day pinch pot pieces, and we could spend a lot more time doing this sort of hand building, but the idea would be, well, how do I get larger, or how do I get more intricate works? And so we'll oftentimes start with hand building, but today we're going to be adding coils onto it while the bottom dries and offers a sort of a bit of structural stability. And as we add then coils up the top, we can get larger forms or more intricate forms. It also allows us to work much thinner with the works. So I'm going to set these aside, hand wedge out a piece of clay, and go ahead and pinch out what we'll call the base of our final coil pot. So this being the second or third pinch pot that we've done so far this semester, you're probably working much faster than you previously have. But keep in mind, it's the small repetitive deformations, little pinches along the way, that make this kind of thing possible. If your piece of clay is ripping, cracking, you're either working too fast or your clay is just too dry. Now I'm changing the sort of basic design of my pinch pot. The ones that I've done earlier were sort of deeper bowl-shaped pieces. This, because it's going to be the bottom of a little bit larger pot, is a bit more dished. I'm already kind of seeing it in my mind where I want the bowl to sort of come out and belly out to the sides. One of the things that I'm going to challenge you guys to do with this project will be to work thinner than your previous projects, and also work on a form that sort of defies gravity a bit more. Our small cups, they're pretty obedient, right? As I'm pinching them up on their walls, they don't want to tip over, they don't want to flop over. They stand up pretty easily. They've got a nice flat edge. With our coil pots, because we'll be adding coils over the course of a couple of days, we're able to work thinner, and we're able to do things that we couldn't do in sort of an all-at-once pinch pot. The clay will support itself from underneath, and then we can kind of build out from there. I'm going to set this aside and actually begin practicing a bit of coil rolling. I recommend that you guys let this sit either overnight in your bins to stiffen up, to leather hard, or if you've got a little extra time on your hands, you could sort of do a little bit of coil practicing, and then maybe by the time you come back to it, it will be ready to accept. It'll be ready to accept its first few coils. So let's set this aside and do some coil practicing. The canvas boards that you guys have will be really great surfaces for doing our coil rolling, because they're not going to, the coils won't stick. If you use a tabletop or something that's got like a plasticky finish on it, anything that's a sealed surface, even the stainless steel tables that we have in the studio at school, they won't roll out very well. They just get real sticky. Could work depending on how much cleanup you want to do, but I recommend using your canvas boards. If you have access to a little bit larger canvas board, obviously you can roll much larger coils, but for the purpose of what we're doing right now with these practices, just kind of getting our fingertips used to being able to roll nice round coils, it sounds like a really easy thing to do, but let's practice and see how well it goes. Because the canvas boards are really dry, they're going to be pulling moisture out of your coils constantly, the same way that it pulls moisture out of your pots, and so it's really handy to have a spray bottle close by. Don't soak your canvas board, but just kind of give it a light spray. That way, as I bring clay to it, the coils will last a bit longer. I'm working with a pretty small amount of clay for right now. Remember what I said earlier, we want to make the walls really nice and thin on these coil pots. So the idea would be, how do I get a nice thin, probably pencil diameter or slightly thinner coil out of this piece that's fairly consistent? So I'm going to put it down on my canvas board here and do a couple of rolling demonstrations. It's really common to just get sort of like a flat tire like feel out of a coil, because as I'm starting my coils, I'm only rolling the coil about halfway. If you're only using, a couple of digits worth of fingers to do the rolling, your coil isn't making a complete rotation. Much better to get sort of like a fingertip to the heel of your hand kind of roll going, and eventually two hands. And I'm applying pressure from the inside of the coil out, and so you can kind of see how my fingers are starting close in and opening up. And so even though I've got, fairly small canvas board here to work on, I'm able to get a pretty decent coil. Now, one of the kind of important things about coil rolling is if my clay is too dry, if I pick up a coil, roll it to about the diameter of my pinky, and bend it in half, you'll start to notice pretty significant cracks right on the seam. You see how my clay doesn't have, it's got one little crack, but nothing too bad. It's happy to be bent and then lay out again without breaking. That's a really good sign that my clay is the correct dryness for doing this kind of coil rolling. So I'm going to snap my coil and see if I can't get a little bit thinner. And once I reach the ends of my canvas board, snap it again into half and see if I can go a little thinner. Right now I'm approaching about the thickness of a coil that I could start consider bringing over to the clay. I'm not going to add a coil that's thicker than my final wall thickness is sort of what I'm planning for. So start with about a pinky thickness, and then if you can actually bring smaller, that's even better. Something pencil diameter is probably a good target to hit, but if you really want to challenge yourself to make a nice thin walled piece, you can roll out some very, very thin coils and have them still work for this project. At a certain point, it gets a little tricky to score and slip them in, but you could push it even smaller. Something about the diameter of maybe a small paintbrush. And so I want you to try that. Now, if you're struggling with the flat tire thump, 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 thump kind of thing going on with your coils, just be patient with it. Make sure you're doing a full rotation with those coils. Practice a few of these, but that coil would be a really great coil then to bring over to my piece. It's not going to work to sort of stockpile these coils. Once you've practiced them, go ahead and mush them up. That's okay. You might be able to reuse this clay, but we've got a lot of clay to replenish your stocks at school, so if this gets a little bit dried out during your practices, don't worry about it. I'd rather have you practice and get good while your piece is drying than to be frustrated while you're trying to roll out the coils with your piece ready to build. I'm going to give this piece probably another 20 minutes or so before I come back to continue filming the tutorial. For you guys, it may be an overnight. I'm going to see if I can't do a couple of days worth of work here in the first tutorial. I'll catch up with you guys in a few minutes. Okay, so I let my the sort of base of my pinch pot, or the base of my coil pot, dry. You guys very likely will dry overnight in your bin, and I would maybe suggest leaving it just sitting right on the canvas board, not sitting on the plastic. But I just put mine sort of in front of a fan 5 or 10 minutes, and it'll do about the same thing, kind of depending on how much humidity is in the air where you happen to be working. The pinch pot that I've got, I've already started to thin out once it started to kind of dry a bit more. I've got it down to about the thickness of the base that I want. I want the base to have a little bit of heft to it so that I can have a nice flat bottom. As I add coils to it, it has some structural support. And I've got a few coils rolled out. So the materials that you're going to need in order to actually get your pinch pot rolling are the small blending and smoothing rib that you've got in your kit. You will need your slip and a slip brush. The slip that you're working with should be about the consistency of, say, ketchup or mayonnaise or whatever your preferred condiment is. It should sit in the bristles and not fall off. But not be so thick that you can't brush it into the score lines. So now we're about ready to start adding the coils on, and I want you to sort of take a good look at your piece, get a sense from the side roughly, what direction you want to take it, because every coil you add is sort of a step either towards or away from that ideal sort of form. I'll explain what I mean about that here in a second. Let's get the first coil on. And we'll talk about how to plan out your forms a bit more. So I'm rolling down my coils to just slightly under the size of sort of a pencil diameter. And I'm limited by the size of my canvas board. Once it starts to hang off the edges of the canvas board, that's about it for me. So before I stick a coil onto this piece, I need to make sure that the coil and the pot, or the coil and the previous coil, every time I'm laying another row of these on, gets stitched together. And the way to do that would be to use the scoring tool. And it's really handy to sort of have the ability to sort of easily rotate your piece. And I know that the canvas boards have a bit of texture to them, so rotating it, doesn't work so great. So here's sort of a low-tech solution to that. You can use a small scrap of the plastic that you have in your kit. And this is going to serve sort of a double purpose. You're going to prevent the bottom of your piece from drying out too much by sort of scooting this underneath the pot. That way, as the canvas board continues to sort of pull moisture out, it doesn't over dry the bottom too quickly. And you get sort of a nice way of pivoting that piece. It slides much more, sort of glides nicely over the canvas board. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just kind of aggressively scratching, or what's called scoring, that mating surface. And I will do the same thing down the length of my coil. I'll make sure that anywhere that the clay is going to touch clay, it's been wounded, been scored. And then I will bring slip to the surface. I only need to slip one side here, and instead of brushing the slip into place, I'm just sort of dabbing it into place, making sure that I've begun sort of the process of almost like melting or welding the two pieces of clay together. The liquid clay really helps that process. If I do this correctly, as I construct the clay piece, the walls of the clay won't maintain their kind of individual coil-like structure. They will be all welded together into a solid wall of the pot. So as I come all the way around, it looks like my coil is just about long enough to make it once around the pot. That's okay if it's not quite long enough. Now I'm going to do sort of a process of pushing that coil into place. This is one of the reasons why the base of your piece, whatever's holding up the undersides, needs to be a little stiff, right? Because I'm kind of squishing that coil down into position. It's kind of a squish and a pinch. I'm pushing down with one finger and then pinching the back side. Pushing it down basically welds that coil down into its other score marks. It stitches it together. And then the pinch is sort of a way to match thickness. I want to make sure that my pot walls are somewhat uniform, so that kind of press pinch. And I usually go around twice just to make sure, especially because I'm down here at the beginning of the pot wall. I want to make sure that everything stitches together. So I've got my first row. Before I do any smoothing at all, I'm going to add another coil. So I'll go ahead and rough up those edges again. Anywhere that the clay is going to be touching clay, especially work that edge where the seam was. And since I'm kind of running out of room on my canvas board, I'm going to switch over to the tabletop. Remember, as you're rolling your coils, just put a tiny little bit of water on the canvas board. That way the coils roll out and they keep their humidity. If your coils are cracking, it means they're too dry and they're not going to want to, not going to blend into your pot very well. I'm going to start this coil a little bit offset from where my previous coils ended. That way I can kind of fill in that gap. I don't want all of my coils to line up with the exact same crack. That might make for a weak spot in the clay. And with 2 coils added to my pot, I'm at a point now where I'm starting to actually expand the diameter. One of the kind of dilemmas you guys will have as we grow these pinch pots, or these coil pots I should say, is that your traveling bins are pretty low, they're pretty squatty, and so you don't really have the option of growing a very tall pot if you hope to be able to use the bins. And I recommend using the bins. They're a really nice way to kind of slow dry your work. But if you really want to get larger, you'll either have to find another bin or find a different way of sort of covering the piece. One option that would give you sort of more height would be a bucket. Buckets have the same kind of seal around the bottom, and that would be a really great way of both traveling with your piece and covering it up to dry it overnight. Traveling with a really large bin like the one that I demonstrated earlier is probably not the greatest idea. That's not the friendliest. But if you wanted to set something like that up at your home studio, that would allow you to build on a much larger scale. The last thing I'll demonstrate in this tutorial before I kind of turn you guys loose to do a little bit of work has to do with the sort of placement of the coils on the piece. So I'll lay this coil on, I'll do a little bit of drawing and help explain how I'm already kind of predicting some of these early coils, predicting what the final shape or form of this pot will be. I have a couple of options every time I lay a coil on to this coil pot. I can lay it into a position that is going to grow the piece, grow it out. I can lay the coil on in a way that's going to grow it up, or I can lay a coil on that's going to choke the piece or kind of pinch the edges in, pinch the diameter in. And it all depends on sort of the angle. If you noticed in these first couple of coils that I added on, I'm adding them just to the outside, slightly to the outside of the previous coil. By doing that, I'm guaranteeing that the pot will grow in diameter each time I lay a coil onto the piece. And I'll do the same thing with this coil, laying it just outside of the pot. Now, each time I do that, I'll be getting a larger and larger diameter piece. Be careful as you grow your pot in this way, because you can actually grow a pot that will get so wide it will flop down. So after adding just a couple of coils here, I'm already realizing that this pot is going to need some time to rest. and I could either give it a few minutes in front of a fan. I could use a blow dryer to maybe speed up the dry times just a little bit, or I could leave it under the clay bin again and come back to it the next day. What that looks like up close is if I'm sort of starting my basic pinch pot with this dished form, right? This is roughly the kind of size and thickness of the piece. As I add my coils to that piece, those coils kind of come in and they stack on top of each other. Now I sort of want my piece to continue moving outward in that direction for a little bit and then eventually sort of turn back. And so what I'm kind of getting in my mind already is a basic shape or form that I would like my pot to take. It's really handy for you to have this idea because it's going to help you understand how many coils it might take of sort of stacking that coil slightly to the outside or slightly to the inside or slightly to the outside. These decisions on how I lay those coils, whether it's stitched here, here, or here, are the kind of gradual decision-making process that goes in. If I have an idea of the general shape that I want my pot to go, I'm coming to my pot with that coil in a more meaningful way. Now, because the work on these pots, guys, is so rotational, this little piece of plastic underneath here makes, makes it really nice. It's sort of a low friction rotation, but we have a couple of other sort of things in the studio that might really help. We can bring them into the studio, and you might even be curious about potentially purchasing something like this for your home studio space. This is a sculpture stand, and it's a bit of a heavy-duty one. It's actually designed for much larger pieces of work, 25, 30, 50 pounds of work. So what we're using, kind of overkill for these small pinch pots. And the price tag for a big sculpture stand can be sort of overwhelming. But the rotational control that you have is really nice. Now, I found, after doing just a little shopping around, that cake dressing or cake makers use similar work stands. They're not quite as heavy duty as a sculpture stand. You wouldn't probably want to do 20, 30, 40 pounds of clay on a stand like this, but they, one, have a much smoother action to them, and two, they're really cheap. 10, 12, 15 bucks maybe, and so the only bummer is that they're kind of huge for something this small, but because you can just kind of park your pot right down in the middle and then do all of your rotational work. If you really like the idea of designing a piece that has a lot of symmetry to it, rotational work stand is really handy. So I've got a couple of these we'll put in the studios, and gonna let you guys kind of work with them if you want to while you're at school. And then if you're really excited, let me know by email and I'll kick you a link to the ones that I purchased. I'm excited to see where you guys go with this piece. And if you have any questions, I'll catch up with you in the studio.